Welcome, everyone, to Indications and Warnings with Chuck Farrer, co-produced by Alan Brewer. Chuck and I are recording this episode on Tuesday, March 18, 2025. It is day 1119 of Russia's full-scale genocidal invasion of Ukraine. And today is the day, Chuck, that Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin had an hours-long phone call about Ukraine, about Trump's proposed ceasefire in this war. Now, supposedly, Putin agreed to such a ceasefire, also imposed conditions that would be wholly unacceptable to Ukraine. Let's start with that phone call, Chuck.
Well, let's look at this from a results oriented boots on the ground perspective to start with. Regardless of what Mr. Putin said, the city of Kyiv is under Russian attack as we speak. Okay, we have an expression down in South Mississippi where I'm from, and that is, "Don't piss on my shoe, tell me it's raining." I stuck my neck out editorially this morning and wrote a piece for Indications and Warnings on the Twitter cycle that expected nothing to come of this phone call today. But I urged listeners, listen to what noises Washington will make today, what they will do to sort of try to convince you that the needle has been, and in fact, it has not been moved, Alan, and we are still in a shooting war.
It hasn't been moved. What actually worries me is that Putin made demands Trump could accept. For example, to cease military supply to Ukraine. Well, Trump has already turned that supply off once. To cease intelligence sharing with Ukraine. We know that Trump has also turned off intelligence once. So Putin is asking from Trump something that Trump has already done, which makes it very easy for Trump to do it again. This is classic Russian negotiation.
It is, and let's look at it from Putin's view. He is nowhere close to winning this war. And since August, he's been nowhere near close to taking back the Kursk salient. Well, what finally did work for Russia? Well, when the United States unilaterally decided to throw a pillowcase over Ukraine's head in round 5 of this prize fight, we found very quickly that Russian troops facing blinded Ukrainian units, well, they actually could be effective in their meat wave attacks. Putin also delights in the fact that during interrupted periods of U.S. arms supply, i.e., thank you, Mike Johnson, and yes, I still remember your name and what you did. During the interruption of arms supply, we had a Russia resurgent. We had the Kharkiv offensive. We had the Avdiivka offensive take fruit, etc. So Putin knows what the U.S. does that's good for him, and he's asking for more of it.
Well, Chuck, this is not anything close to a peace negotiation. It's barely a negotiation for a ceasefire. It's more like a hostage negotiation without anyone standing up for the hostage. When you listen to what Putin demanded, not only these actions that America could take again, but he demanded that Ukraine halt what he termed forced mobilization. Ukraine is not forcing mobilization of Ukrainian citizens. He also demanded that Ukraine admit atrocities they had committed in Kursk. Now, I'm not a potent negotiator in any way, But wouldn't you want the chief negotiator on your side? In this case, it's Donald Trump. But if you're Ukraine, don't you want the United States to make some demands of Russia? For example, admitting the war crimes and atrocities you have committed in this war? We don't hear any such demands from the United States and Donald Trump, and I don't understand why.
Well, we last time we talked, neither one of us wanted to use the word ceasefire. Neither one of us wanted to use the word negotiation. I will maybe use the word dialogue, in which, although dialogue doesn't fit, because in any dialogue there is some give and take. In exchange for Ukraine ceasing military training, what exactly is Russia going to do? In exchange for Ukraine admitting atrocities, what's Ukraine going to do about the approximately 70,000 dead buried around the city of Mariupol? In terms of Russia demanding that its victims apologize for the very crimes that Russia committed, I mean, that's old hat. But I cannot, and I don't see my way to understanding what this phone call or anything else that Washington seems to be preparing. Well, how does this lead to a lasting, durable peace for Ukraine? It simply doesn't. And as General Kellogg said, one of the parties in this negotiation has already been hit in the face with a 2x4. And I think it's time for a little less carrot to Putin and a little more 2x4.
Yeah, a lot more 2x4. Look, the very fact that the United States and Russia have held bilateral negotiations really for weeks now. They've agreed to restaffing embassies and consulates. So there are side issues. That actually bothers me too, Chuck. The United States and Russia have every right to talk about bilateral relations between the two countries. But this makes the main issue quite murky. It distracts from the main issue. This is what bothers me as well. The main issue, of course, is getting Russia out of Ukraine, keeping Russia on the hot seat of war crimes and atrocities that have been committed. Trump is doing none of this. Rather, he wants to set up hockey games between the NHL and Russia, and I don't know if the Ukrainian hockey team would get to play or not.
Well, that's just it. As you and I talked late last week, in anticipation of this phone call, all I wanted people to look at are the squeaky noises coming out of Washington, the hockey games, the frank exchange of views, the we are reticent to comment at the existing juncture for fear of exasperating. Forget it. It's absolute nonsense. As we speak, cruise missiles are slamming into Ukrainian apartment buildings. There's your ceasefire. It's boots on the ground. I personally have been through hundreds of ceasefires that evaporate like daydreams, right? There is no ceasefire. There is no road to a ceasefire. There are no appropriate preconditions upon which to even base a ceasefire, 72 hours, 30 days, whatever it is. And I promise the listening audience, Russia will violate the terms of any suspension of hostilities.
Well, of course, they already have, and they will continue to violate them. What strikes me also, Chuck, is that Trump is basically performing as the most amateurish negotiator you can imagine. The team he has brought around him to assist him, apparently, in negotiating, also amateurish in international negotiations of any kind whatsoever. Steve Witkoff, Marco Rubio hasn't shown himself to be an astute negotiator. And again, what negotiation do you know about where the first step is for one side just to give the other side everything it could possibly want? This is essentially what the United States is doing for Vladimir Putin.
And I would also, so let's continue down this path. Let's assume for a second that the suspension of hostilities in Ukraine, good or bad, that motivates everything. There just simply has to be peace, and it has to happen right now. And we're going to give Russia everything that they possibly want so we can listen and fill in the blank on your multiple choice test. We'll give Russia everything it needs so we can have a lasting, durable, economic and geopolitically stable Ukraine in the future. None of that works. It categorically does not. Russia speaks the language of power and violence. That's the language they understand. I half joked, it isn't a joke to me, there are 60 to 100 Russian shadow tankers, very large crude carriers operating worldwide. Seize them all. You can seize them under the premise of inspection for safety at life at sea. Are their crews adequately licensed? Are they insured? Is their seamanship conducted in a safe and orderly manner? The answer to all those questions is no. You grab those ships for 72 hours, 6 months, 6 weeks, now you have Russia's attention. And it's a non-kinetic, out of theater operation. And believe me, there is no way for Russia to respond to it. No way.
Well, they didn't respond when the Finns seized the cargo ship in the Baltic.
The Eagle S, she's still anchored off Helsinki.
Yeah. To continue our focus on these so-called negotiations, again, really, the United States, as the chief mediator on behalf of Ukraine, should simply have sought to bring Russia and Ukraine together in talks. Rather, the United States has indicated what Ukraine should give up to Russia. You cannot be either a fair-minded or a forceful mediator if you give up negotiating points before negotiations begin. And the other thing the United States has not done is provided an agenda of topics for discussion. There should be such a list. It should include the kidnapped Ukrainian children. It should include the kidnapped Ukrainian citizens who were forcibly moved to Russia. It should include a review of war crimes, specifically from Bucha and Irpin, as well as mention of the torture chambers in Kherson. It should include inquiries about the fate of 70,000 Ukrainians in the city of Mariupol. It should include, and I guess there was some discussion of a prisoner exchange, an equal number for an equal number supposedly to begin tomorrow. But it should certainly include mention of exchange of prisoners. I mean, it is so thin, the support that Ukraine has offered diplomatically. It really worries me.
Well, we have another of the squeaky noises coming from Washington, a prisoner exchange tomorrow. which has been planned months ago. There is an ongoing cartel that exchanges prisoners of war that the United States has nothing to do with. Zero. Again, someone is telling me it's raining.
Right.
The only concession item bullet point here, bullet point might be the best way to put this. Vladimir Putin said he may stop shooting at Ukrainian power plants for 30 days. Do you know what he didn't say? He isn't going to stop firing cruise missiles into Ukrainian apartment buildings. He didn't say that. He didn't say he's going to suspend air operations over Ukraine. Didn't say that. Close air support. Didn't say that. Didn't say he's not going to use chemical weapons on the battlefield anymore. He didn't say that. So, these are the things that and again, I projected this path in my mind, that contacts and perhaps even phone calls would continue, and Washington would keep spinning this gossamer dream of how wonderful these negotiations are going. And eventually, even the major networks would see how thin and insubstantive this dialogue is. And not this week, because they'll ride this prisoner exchange into the Friday news break, but next week and the week after, when nothing else is going on, Washington will have to try something else. And that is the 2x4.
Well, as long as it's aimed at Vladimir Putin. But this is also what worries me, Chuck. And I have become very pessimistic over the last few days, frankly. But it seems to me that Donald Trump is setting up Ukraine to look bad. Donald Trump is setting up Ukraine to have to say no. Conditions that Putin wants to impose and that Trump is all too ready to accept, these conditions are poison pills, and we won't swallow them.
Well, I think it would be, I think that President Zelensky is a very intelligent man. They always say he's a comedian. Look, he's a trained attorney. He has a legalistic mind. He built himself a pretty big and successful production company. It's one thing to be talent in Hollywood. It's another thing to spin your talent into, for example, a studio, right? I think we can look forward to Ukraine turning as much as possible toward Europe, gathering a consensus there, because the time is going to have to come where Ukraine and President Zelensky says, look, it's not okay that Russia is occupying Luhansk, Donetsk, and Zaporizhzhia and Kherson. That isn't okay. It was taken from us by force of arms. Our people were raped, killed, dispossessed, murdered, buried in mass graves, and they're not part of Russia. This is sovereign Ukrainian territory. And to say this, we are willing to negotiate, but we are not going to start at the point where we are recognizing Russian territory. And to say to the world, and you don't have to be a geopolitical genius, as long as there is the Sevastopol naval base and it is occupied by Russian naval surface forces and naval aviation components, Ukraine does not have an economic future. They do not have geopolitical stability. Crimea is the blue chip.
And Crimea is Ukraine, at least the way I see it.
Listen, I may be a little biased, but that's the way I see
it. Chuck, it's quite possible that if what Donald Trump is doing is simply setting up Ukraine to appear to be the bad guy and appear to be the nation that does not want peace, although we all know Ukraine, more than anyone, wants peace. Ukraine has suffered immeasurably, not only over the last 3 years, but over the last 11 years since Russia illegally annexed Crimea and since Russia set up the fake People's Republics of Luhansk and Donetsk, occupying and putting millions of Ukrainians under occupation, maltreating them in any number of ways, including torture, I might add. But if Trump succeeds in setting Ukraine up in this way, and Ukraine says no way to actual negotiations about a ceasefire, Trump decides he's going to turn off intelligence. Trump decides no more military aid for Ukraine. Can Ukraine fight on alone?
It's going to be very difficult. I still say this. Ukraine is unconquerable for Russian military arms. Should America turn off all intelligence as it did, we saw the results in Kursk. That will facilitate Russian advances, but there's a point at which Russia won't be able to hold on to the territory that it conquers. This war would turn into Afghanistan, just as it was for the United States. There is, for example, that intelligence gap can't be filled by European assets. They don't have the orbital platforms. They don't have the global reach that the United States has. That is really disturbing to me. You know, that's the grizzly bear in the room for me, is whether or not that plug gets pulled again. But there's another way to look at this as well. Russia is doing everything it can every day to get to Kyiv, and that's never going to happen. Okay, it isn't going to happen. Now, should the president pull the plug once and forever on Ukraine, the situation becomes extraordinarily grave, but it isn't going to be the end of Ukraine. There's going to be an even uglier period of this war, right? But this is an existential fight for Ukraine. Ukraine is not going to get to roll over and say, okay, we'll give you everything you've taken. They can't. You know, we'll get another Holodomor. We will get the German occupation of Germany. And anyone who has read history knows how horrendous that was. So my big worry, Alan, is that even if Europe pulls together, gets to a quasi-war fitting and gets into this conflict, I see the U.S. as having really, they've got the three aces, right? Europe might come up with a pair of kings, but the three aces are in the hand of Washington.
I mean, I said, can Ukraine fight on alone? Of course, they would not be fighting alone. Europe is becoming Ukraine's backstop, and there are additional nations, Canada, Australia, South Korea, Japan, have, and Turkey, by the way, have all indicated that they stand with Ukraine. We can look at what some of these European nations might be able to do for Ukraine. One is to deploy a peacekeeping force, even in advance of an agreed to ceasefire. Turkey has now offered to deploy its troops as part of that peacekeeping force. England and France are talking about a force of about 30,000 peacekeepers. That is a token peacekeeping force in Ukraine. Everybody has to understand that. You have, a 700 or nearly 1,000-mile long front line. There's no way 30,000 peacekeeping troops can enforce and monitor events along such a line. What else could Ukraine's European allies do right now that would give Ukraine the kind of backstop they need if America disappears?
Well, I'd like to let's take the listeners down the peacekeeping path here just for a minute. It would be an unprecedented operation. Why do I say that? Well, generally, you get peacekeepers put into a place, and I picked this example deliberately, both from personal experience and the bad way it came out. You put peacekeepers into Lebanon, where they are keeping apart a mosaic of, contestants. And you come in of the peacekeeping force, at least on paper, that should be stronger than any of the opponents or contestants. Okay. So we can all right, everyone understands that. The guys with blue helmets come in. Here's a unique characteristic of this war. You're coming in with the NATO force vis-a-vis the Russian force, and arguably they're going to be at some sort of military parity. Personally, I don't have much respect for Russian arms capabilities, especially backed by NATO intelligence. But you have almost a peer-to-peer situation between peacekeepers and at least one of the component parts here. I have long experience as a peacekeeper. There are rules of engagement that are saddled on the peacekeepers. I was in a place where the rule of engagement was you could not return fire unless you saw the person point the weapon at you and you saw the muzzle flash. Then you are authorized, and I am not exaggerating one jot or tittle. Man, weapon, muzzle flash. Okay, I think you can see if we scale this up now to a peer-on-peer engagement, I'm talking about artillery, I'm talking about air, I'm talking about cruise missiles, I'm talking about long-range surface-to-surface missiles. Do you see how that muzzle flash, it isn't going to work. It's one thing at a checkpoint and you're not going to let an Israeli tank come through. I've tried that also. It didn't work out so well, both for the tank driver and for my military career. But what do you do if it's 4 mechanized companies of Russian armor? So I'm not saying peacekeepers are bad. I'm not saying it's unworkable for Ukraine. I'm just telling people that at the Pentagon, there will be much hand-wringing and gnashing of teeth because they're just going to say, holy cow, how do we make this thing work?
What about Sky Shield, the European effort to deploy enough fighter jets to protect the skies above Western Ukraine?
Absolutely a doable thing. See, there are the force multiplication and the assets. There's a place that NATO is going to have an advantage over, for example, the Russian Air Force. NATO, with or without the United States, is going to have the ability. It'll stretch them a little bit to keep an AWACS up on the air and fighters patrolling around on standby. But again, here we've got rules of engagement. Here come 19 radar contacts screaming towards Kyiv. They have to be discerned. What are they? Are they Russian strike fighters? Are they cruise missiles? How are they going to be deconflicted with local air defense? What happens if a Bear bomber gets within range? Do you get to shoot the archer or do you have to shoot down the arrows? But again, all of these are soluble problems. They truly are. But right now, the climate in Washington is a fire sale, right? What Russia needs to hear is, look, I might seize all your tankers around the world. I might declare a no-fly zone over Ukraine. Why don't you talk me out of it, Vlad? I'm serious. We don't owe anything to Russia. Peace is not the priority here, Alan, the way I see it. The priority here is, and let's just be greedy, the priority is a stable and prosperous Europe that may or may not include Ukraine, right? If I were cynical. But we want geopolitical stability.
Well, sure we do.
Yeah, you and I do. Marco Rubio, I don't know.
Well, more importantly, Donald Trump, and even if he did want it, would he know how to get there? Again, look.
We make each other laugh here sometimes.
Yeah. When Donald Trump speaks, half the time he's talking about nothing. He just uses, big, beautiful, huge words and phrases. They explain nothing. The other half of the time, he's simply insulting someone. It could be Volodymyr Zelensky. It could be a federal judge. It could be a former president. It makes no difference. But that's half of what Trump says, just big empty bloviation. The other half of what Trump has to say, mostly ad hominem attacks on folks. The one person he hasn't said anything bad about, Vladimir Putin. I don't understand why. Putin is an indicted war criminal. This, of course, makes absolutely no difference to Donald Trump. But, look, part of the White House statement of the phone call with Putin today ends not with a statement about Ukraine, and I'll read it to you from the White House press release here on March 18, 2025. The two leaders agreed that a future with an improved bilateral relationship between the United States and Russia has a huge upside. This includes enormous economic deals and geopolitical stability when peace has been achieved. In other words, the end of this press release is about what's in it for Trump, and he wants to convince the American people there's something in it for them too. And again, there are those big empty words, a huge upside and enormous economic deals. They're completely meaningless, but there is no statement in here about how aggrieved Ukraine is, no statement about the war crimes and atrocities committed by Russia. You don't see the word justice mentioned anywhere.
No, and I hope the audience will remember the most chilling thing that Alan said in the last show is that eventually you worry that POTUS may simply lose interest. And then the most chilling words, he may see that the spotlight has gone to some other part of the stage and he'll go there instead. This president has a track record of great aspirations abroad in terms of geopolitical negotiations. He was going to save the Middle East. That didn't happen. This is as complex a problem, perhaps not as complex ethnically, religiously, historically. However, he is facing a complex and wily and pathologic interlocutor. Mr. Putin is a criminal. He's a leg breaker. He's a KGB thug with blood on his hands. He has poisoned people. He has killed them with radioactive isotopes. This guy is cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs, right? You need adult leadership in the room. And I wrote, sadly, about the departure of probably the only adult in there, General Kellogg. And he has been sidelined and replaced by Marco Rubio. Not a part equivalency there in my estimation, but I'd be happy to be surprised by Secretary Rubio. I don't expect to be.
Yeah, I don't know. Look, even Kellogg gave it a try to kowtow to Trump and to butter him up, whether to save his position on the negotiating team or simply to save face in some way, and he failed at that. But you would want some negotiator with military background, experience, and wisdom on the team, because there's one thing that neither the Biden nor the Trump administrations have attempted yet, and that's fully arming Ukraine in such a way that it can militarily defeat Russia. That strategy has never, ever been attempted.
And that's what I think it's going to take. I truly think that's what it's going to take. Ukraine has been, to put it mildly, kept on a leash. They have never been supplied adequately so that they could contemplate the large-scale ground maneuver offensive operations to take back Russian territory. And even when they do manage to scrape together enough so that their planning and general staff officers could say, yes, we've got enough ducks to get them in a row and project a little power, the United States will do something to convince them that that's not a good idea. For example, Mike Johnson. And I am not happy that you and I called it 2 years ago. And we said, you've just added 2 years to the war. You've convinced the Ukrainians they cannot depend on the United States. And frankly, you know, I used to be ashamed to say that, but I'm not ashamed anymore. It's just the way it is.
Exactly.
We are an unreliable partner. You ask the Afghanis, right? You ask the South Vietnamese. You ask anyone who really had the fat in the fire how far the United States is willing to go for you. You know, in Afghanistan is especially poignant for me because I flew with the Afghan Air Force, not as a pilot, as a correspondent. I saw what was going to happen to those guys. So, wow.
Well, you know, Chuck, sure, we're not reliable militarily, but I can't think of any way in which we're reliable. Ask the Canadians if we are a reliable ally or next door neighbor. Ask the Panamanians, do we uphold the treaties we've signed? Ask Denmark or some other members of NATO, do you really trust the United States? I've been asking fellow Americans, do you feel safer and more secure with Donald Trump as your commander-in-chief? And no one has said yes yet.
Alan, remember the days back in our youth, if you were backpacking through Europe as an American, a lot of Americans I knew would sew a Canadian flag on the back of their backpack because America was disliked abroad, very strongly disliked abroad. We're heading back for those days. And you know what? With good reason. With really good reason.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I had better learn how to become a Canadian. My canoe's from Canada.
Canoe, absolutely. Good canoe.
And it has a Canadian flag on the bow, as a matter of fact. To wrap this up, what do you expect to come of this first step that Trump has tried to take here? And it's it's through a phone call with Putin. It's just the two of them. It's actually something you don't really want to see because it's two leaders with such egos and I would say seemingly criminal minds. They must be talking like members of two gangs. How can we divide up the spoils? How can you get something you want, Vlad, and how can I get something I want, Donald? And as I say, this is more like a hostage negotiation. They're talking about a hostage they have tied up on a chair.
I wish I could rebut that metaphor, but I can't. But here is what I expect. I expect more and more squeaky noises from Washington with less and less results. I expect that eventually the American media will notice it. And eventually it's going to be popular opinion. Not that the president cares about that, but I think his efforts are going vis-a-vis Putin are going to seem more and more pathetic and eventually weak. I give him 14 to 21 days before he comes to the conclusion that you just did. And that is, if you want to move the needle with Russia, you need to move the zero line.
Yeah. Which Ukraine is doing, by the way, and we're going to go to some maps in Toretsk and Pokrovsk. I just want to say one final thing about this, Chuck. What Donald Trump doesn't understand is that Vladimir Putin intends to do at the negotiating table what his army was unable to deliver on the battlefield. Putin wants all of Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson oblasts recognized as new Russian territory. He has not conquered those oblasts in Ukraine militarily. He wants Donald Trump, through negotiation, to give him what his military could not achieve on the field. Is Donald Trump so stupid he cannot arrive at that basic conclusion?
I would hope that the president would surround himself, notice this is an aspiration on my part, surround himself with some of the best and brightest minds in national security. I don't mind scholars in national security. In fact, I welcome them, but you need to leaven them with people who have actually slept out in the woods at night with steel flying over their head. And you need someone who has a long and careful and well-grounded perception of exactly what Russia's aims are, right? This is an expansionist power. Ukraine is not enough, okay? Ukraine is the shrimp cocktail. The Baltics are on the main course. That is Lithuania, that is Latvia, that is Estonia, who are all signatories and members of NATO. So here we go. Putin is not going to be happy with biting off what he has of Ukraine and then seeing the Finlandization of what's left. That's not what he wants. You're right.
It's not.
He wants the achievement of his war aims. And by God, he will likely get them at the negotiation table. And yes, unless Europe bucks up and he gets a little, and the president gets some resistance at home. Face it, that's got to be a component, I think.
Yep, it does. Anyone who supports Ukraine, this is a time when Ukraine needs to hear how much you support. And what can you do for Ukraine? Well, you can call your member of Congress and make sure they understand how much you support Ukraine and why. Largely because Ukraine is also fighting for what America has always stood for, and we should welcome them into the fight, give them all the support they need to actually win. We might need their help someday to restore our own democracy. But why hasn't Russia delivered to Putin what he wants in Ukraine? We're going to see exactly why in Toretsk and Pokrovsk, where the Ukrainians are making a lot of headway. I'm especially interested in Toretsk, where Ukraine has chosen to take on some pretty intense urban warfare inside the city of Toretsk.
Yeah, this has been a bright spot. Let me get this map up. Here I go. No, that's Pokrovsk, but I speak from memory here, as we often do. There was a recent Russian assault that went the way the BREWER standard Russian attack, a basically platoon company-sized Russian attack. Stop me if you've heard this one before. Turtle tanks in the front, 3 or 4 armored personnel vehicles, a couple more tanks in a rectilinear daylight assault perpendicular to the zero line, which came to smoldering grief and ruin for the Russian attackers. Uh, there you have it. Russia has 95% of its military concentrated in Ukraine, foregoing all other strategic imperatives with the exception of its irregular forces in Central Africa. Russia can't win this war, not with those kinds of tactics. What worries me, I mean, we can see what's going on the zero line. Those things are actually in control, right? We couldn't expect Ukraine to hold on to the Kursk salient utterly blinded. We just couldn't do that. And Ukraine has very limited abilities for deep reconnaissance. Their tactical reconnaissance in the vicinity of the zero line is pretty good. But you don't want to get in a firefight if you don't have to. So, for example, you want to know where the Russian forces are concentrating pre-assault, because almost every force has to do that. If you can hit them there before they get to you, that's great. Intelligence is turned back on, and you see the efficacy of Ukrainian forces going back up. But there are no new plans. There's no new tactics, no new leadership in the Russian forces. And in Toretsk, we're seeing that Ukraine is actually ascendant and carrying out some difficult combat assignments, especially in urban terrain. Remember, that is a three-dimensional, not a two-dimensional battle. And whoever gets there first guy in the building has a really good chance of holding it. But the Ukrainians are making progress. And I say this a lot, Russian morale is a factor, right? Morale is a factor.
So are the Russian forces in Toretsk exhausted, Chuck, and starved of the supplies they need to hold on? Because that actually is what they are looking at, holding on to Toretsk. I think it is likely that Ukraine will occupy the entire city.
Yeah, I think that's going to happen as well. And Russia faces all sorts of problems. Its military has been eating, it's lost its lubricant, right? This big military machine. And we've been reporting, and I'm happy to say that people go back and hit the hundreds of episodes that you and I have done. We've spoken about the collapse of Russian logistics. We projected what that's going to look like on the zero line for Russia. Look, even I didn't think it would come down to donkeys, though. I mean, I didn't. Look, and that's where it is. It isn't, and it's like, hey, it's not cute. You could look at what happens when you try to drive a golf cart into an infantry assault. Just watch on Twitter and YouTube. It looks great when you camouflage your golf cart, but it's still a golf cart, right? And they wouldn't be doing that if they didn't have to, right? They don't have any other means, right? One guy naked on a motorcycle. That's not it. And don't forget, and this is, the obscenity of the Russian army. You are wounded. You're not even mobile. You're on crutches, and they send you to the zero line. Okay, again, needs must. That's how fragile the Russian military is. And remember, Putin needs peace more than Zelensky and Ukraine need peace.
Yeah, Putin is the one who needs this ceasefire. And if you look at the conditions he imposed, that tells you exactly Putin needs this ceasefire more than Ukraine. That's why he wants military supply to Ukraine to be halted for 30 days, the length of the ceasefire. It's why he wants Ukraine to suspend mobilization of new troops and troop training. That's someone who is asking for the moon. There's no question about that. And my suggestion is to Volodymyr Zelensky, you go right ahead and moon Vladimir Putin. That's the gesture you should turn to in these negotiations.
Well, I really think so. The other thing is, there's no reciprocity there.
Exactly.
You quit supplying Ukraine while I pour men, material, manpower, ammunition, and my air force into Ukraine.
Yeah.
Okay, that's what I mean. Peace is not the priority here. That is not. And even if someone shrugs and there are a lot of people, probably not people who listen to us, but what do we care about Ukraine? We're supposed to stay out of foreign European wars. This is nonsense. Well, let's just talk about the security of Europe. Okay, let's talk about what's going to happen, and I mean it, to Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Well, what's going to happen to those countries? You are dealing with the roaring lion who seeketh whom he may devour. You've got to approach this with your eyes open. You absolutely must. Hey, how did the Vietnam War settlement go? Went great. North Vietnam invaded 6 months later. That was it, and the war was over.
Yeah.
In good faith? I can't remember. Right. And look at the progress of ending a war. 6 months they argued over the shape of the table. Right. This is going to be a long process. And we've got one person driving the negotiations who has an incredibly short attention span.
Short attention span and not very much knowledge of history or how to conduct international negotiations. But one of the reasons these negotiations are so important to Putin, we just looked at in Toretsk, where Ukraine is recovering land in Donetsk. And then if you go along the zero line to Pokrovsk, Pokrovsk has been a goal of Russia since Avdiivka fell, which was, 8 months ago, I think. Russia reached the doorstep of Pokrovsk. Ukraine has kicked them off the doorstep, kicked them right off the front porch of Pokrovsk. And this is a much different terrain than Toretsk is. Toretsk completely urban. It is an urban fight that Ukraine is choosing to enter into in Toretsk. In Pokrovsk, they are pushing Russians back over more or less open terrain. And they're doing that with a lot of success, Chuck.
Yeah, we've got, and the audience, of course, are going to be able to take a look at the map here. The high water mark for Russia was basically they got to a little band of urban terrain south of Pokrovsk proper, little place called Persha-Travina. The Russians were actually right up. So if you were a Ukrainian soldier in a building, you stick your head out and the Russians are going to shoot you. They've been pushed back. They also got as far as Kuturi, and they actually crossed the TO506, got across the railway right away as well. Pokrovsk is going to be a hero city of Ukraine 50 years from now. This is going to be a place like Gettysburg, and it might even be seen as one of the turning points of the war. This is the high water mark of the breakout that occurred after the 10 years it took for Russia to take Avdiivka. Again, because this was not necessarily a question of lack of foresight. It was a lack of resources and perhaps a little mismanagement as well. I'll hand that to you. There was no defense in depth after Avdiivka. Ukraine had to cede territory. Sometimes you trade dirt for time, right? But the fact that Russia could not take Pokrovsk, which, unlike Bakhmut, Chasiv Yar, or Severodonetsk, Pokrovsk is a real transportation junction. It is a place of tactical significance. To me, the fact that they have been unable to close that deal and consummate their assault here, to me, I'm seeing the Russian army not run out of gas, but look, morale is totally a factor, right? You can have the greatest night vision goggles in the world. You can have a thermal rifle scope. You can have the best body armor. You can have all that stuff. If you got people who don't want to fight, it doesn't matter. And Russia is still dealing with, you put 100 vehicles in contact, 38 of them are abandoned on the battlefield. It's not working for Russia. They may never take Pokrovsk. And I say that now at arguably what might be otherwise thought as a pretty dark day in the war. I don't think they're ever going to get to Pokrovsk.
Yeah, it was looking quite dark there for a while. Russia, if you look at the last few maps from Pokrovsk, Russia is throwing a lot of its air power against targets inside the city. I don't know if these are civilian targets. There are still civilians in Pokrovsk, and this is amazing that they find a way to live in a frontline city, but they do. But Russia is throwing its air power into this battle in particular. Are they achieving anything with that, Chuck?
Well, that it's really sort of hard to tell. They so when you see these strikes contiguous to the zero line, what you would hope or what you would see in a regular conflict is if you're going to risk a pilot and a glide bomb and you're going to prosecute an airstrike, you want to hit something of some military significance. With the Russians, it's very, very hard to tell because for them, an apartment building with the lights on is a legitimate military target. I draw the attention, though, of people who are looking at the map. There's a really interesting thing to the right. I don't know what that is. Whatever it is, it's going to stop. That means my margaritas are ready. No. Okay, to the eastern part of the map there, you've got the little town of Hadrika. Consistently Russian airstrikes, close air support going into this city. You can see that it is quite away from the zero line. I haven't moved the zero line, but there is a relevant Ukrainian military presence here in Hrodiivka. It's a thorn in Russia's side. At least every 36 hours, there's an airstrike called in there. So, and again, this shows how permeable the zero line is. It isn't where I draw it on the map. It is a fluid, changing demarcation.
But those airstrikes so far behind the estimated front line, those airstrikes suggest that you might be moving the zero line in just a few more days.
Yeah, it may indeed happen. So I would call attention to another. So there's a Russian airstrike right in the middle of the map. Basically, it is slightly to the east of the M30 highway. If you zoom in on that map, you can see that the Russians hit. It looks like one of the tree lines, right? North-south oriented tree line, and that certainly it's no coincidence that it hits there because all ground movement, or the majority of it, and certainly all of the resupply moves, remember, on those windbreaks in those tree lines. So people who've been following us for a long time and looking at these maps for a long time, it's just another one of those things to look at. I want you to always look at the contour lines, look at where the airstrikes are, because we get really good information on actually where they're coming down. In fact, the amount of information that comes out of this war for a civilian open source aggregator, it's really impressive. This is the kind of stuff you used to get at, battle group level is the quality of the open source intelligence. And again, we triangulate everything. Alan and I work on things and we triangulate our information.
We try to.
We try to.
Chuck has two corners of the triangle. I have only one.
No, that's not true.
In Pokrovsk, Russia has once again used gas on the battlefield. This to me is an indication, although Russia has used gas both in offensive and defensive operations, but to be using it right now in Pokrovsk tells me that Russia is having trouble holding off Ukrainian advances. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. And, not to put too fine a point on it, you are violating the international conventions on chemical warfare, right? CS and CN riot agents, they're kind of the entry level chemical warfare. However, they are proscribed munitions. You don't have the option to use them. This has escalated for Russia. It's one thing to take one infantryman takes a CS grenade, pulls the pin, and throws it in an opposing foxhole, right? That's one thing. When you get 20 or 30 drones carrying these high capacity riot agent gases, so it isn't just the kind of tear gas grenade that LAPD throws, generates massive amounts of gas. Okay, there's an escalation deployed by drone. We have had confirmed accounts of mortar shells delivering these chemical agents and also artillery shells delivering these agents. You are really pushing up against the ceiling of what gets noticed and what doesn't, and in fact, what is a war crime. And in fact, the infantryman throwing the CS grenade, that's a war crime.
Yep. And it's one of the war crimes that have never been mentioned by the United States in this lead up to ceasefire negotiations or beyond the ceasefire to peace negotiations. None of Russia's war crimes and atrocities have been mentioned. That is such an oversight by Trump and by the American negotiators. It really does make you wonder who they're working for and what their real goal might be. You just can't go into negotiations without drawing attention to war crimes, atrocities, to who started the war. It not only makes you look as a weak negotiator, it just makes you look goddamn stupid. If you can't even say Russia is at fault.
Well, one of the unfathomable things, right? The United States pulling out of war crime investigations in Ukraine. Yeah. Unfathomable. And you're dealing with the Russians who cannot even be clever about it. So the rapes and murders and tied up, executed civilians, Russia says that was done by Ukrainians who were using internationally prohibited flechette rounds against Russian troops. It's preposterous. And, for our listeners who weren't alive during the Cold War, and Alan and I unfortunately go back to this, it was this Soviet tactic of up is down, night is day, left is right, east is west. We didn't shoot down that airliner. It wasn't really an airliner. It was a U.S. reconnaissance plane. Do you remember that? That was the Ark. That was the Ark. That's where they come from. And it's possible to negotiate with them. It truly is. But it is impossible to fail to read history, fail to understand to whom you are speaking, where they come from, and the manner in which they conduct dialogue, negotiations, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah. Well, there are a few things I don't think are going to happen. I don't think they're going to happen before our next show later this week, Chuck. I don't think there's going to be an agreed to ceasefire.
Categorically not.
I don't think the Russian economy is going to collapse anytime soon, unfortunately. And, what else? I don't think that Ukraine is going to stop moving forward. I think that they have taken the initiative in Toretsk and Pokrovsk, and we will see more of that. That's my hope anyway.
Well, the other big takeaway from this is the Russians are weak everywhere. there isn't a place on the zero line that a major Ukrainian offensive operation could not penetrate. And there are several places on the long zero line where even a modest Ukrainian effort would gather territory. Ukraine is on a very short lease. Logistically and also operationally, they look over their shoulder. God knows what the next edict coming out of Washington is going to be. They don't know when or if they're going to be blinded again. So therefore, were I a Ukrainian war planner, I'd say, look, we can't risk any offensive operations right now because we don't know when the plug's going to be pulled. And it is much better to hold what we have despite the tactical opportunities that we cannot take advantage of right now.
Well, that's the third thing. We're not going to see a Ukrainian breakthrough on the zero line as much as we want to. And just imagine how tragic it would be, Chuck, if Ukraine did break through somewhere. They did have the follow-on forces they needed. They advanced 50 kilometers south of Pokrovsk, and Trump pulls the plug. That would be as tragic as you can get on the zero line, if you ask me.
Absolutely. And I want people to feel some outrage because that absolutely could happen. As unbelievable as it sounds, we've already seen him do it. And, to what end? Let's look at the big picture. Ukraine has been dragged by the hair into counseling with the battering spouse. They've had their face banged off the table, held up by their hair. And we've said, hey, well, okay, you want the living room, the kitchen, and the dining room. You can have that. Now, why don't you make nice? That isn't the way it's going to go. Europe needs to step up. And I don't say that as the way it comes out of Washington. It's necessary for European survival. They have to step up because the big gorilla has gone off the reservation, right? The United States cannot be trusted. It is capricious. It is an unreliable ally. There is one good thing, and I want everyone to set your clock. This is only going to last 4 years. Okay. The war is probably going to go on for the next 4 years.
And it really could. We might talk a little bit more about that later this week, Chuck. But and I know we have a couple of other maps to take a look at, but I'm going to postpone those until later this week. There's a map from Kherson, which is interesting, again, from the point of view of Ukrainian cross-river raids. We've heard those rumors of the Russians wanting to cross the Dnipro and resume their invasion of Kherson Oblast. We've heard rumors of Russians south of Kyiv wishing to launch a new offensive in that direction. But we're going to continue to keep our eyes on Pokrovsk, Toretsk, Chasiv Yar, Kupiansk, Kreminna, and yes, on Kursk and on Sumy inside Ukraine. And I think we might be bringing you news of a Ukrainian attack across the border into Belgorod Oblast. There are rumors of that occurring as well. So there's always a lot to look at and take under consideration. We try to keep these shows, well, at least Chuck does. I don't do a good job of it. We try to keep these shows around 60 or 75 minutes.
Well, it's always a pleasure, Alan. We are in we are covering subject matter and circumstances that I never could have anticipated. Truly. I just, and again, the whole purpose of this show is we are part of the information war effort, right? There is so much Russian disinformation that has been elegantly placed, right? Many people who are otherwise well-informed and think themselves well-informed on this war, they don't understand the realities of what's going on the ground, right? Russia is flailing. They are delivering bullets on, donkeys. It's not going well for them. We want to help you dominate your own individual information war microcosm. Get other people and bring them to the site, tell them about this, and we want you also to have a better picture of what's actually going on in Ukraine. This is not a lost cause by any stretch of the imagination. And it's very important for the security of Europe and ultimately the security of the United States.
Yes, ultimately for the security of the United States, of Chuck and me and you and your families, of my family, of my children. It is about their future security, their future opportunity, and their future prosperity. I think everyone who watches this show can figure that one out. We will be back later this week, Chuck. Everyone, please do subscribe to the Information Warfare Initiative. Please do subscribe to Indications and Warnings. Follow Chuck, follow me on Twitter. It's where you will get news about when the next broadcast is coming up. And all that information is posted beneath this video in the section called More Information. The other thing you can find there are verified charities in Ukraine that you can give to as generously as you possibly can. And we hope that something of what you hear on Indications and Warnings might help you make that decision to become an active supporter of Ukraine and to give as much as you possibly can. Again, you can find those opportunities below this video. Chuck and I are not just here a few times a week trying to make sense out of what's happening.
Yeah, there's a lot you can do. Ukraine needs everything. Everything you can think of. Your money that you give, look, that's the best way to get whatever they need. Don't ship clothing look, they need clothing, but the best way to get it there is money. So please, if you can, please do. We do. And, I'm proud to say, I won't say what city I'm in, but I took a walk around the city today, and I'm happy to say I saw a lot of Ukrainian flags on cars, on houses. The city where I am knows where I am, and I just want to tell you, it's widespread here.
You put up that Ukrainian flag, or you put a Ukrainian flag on the bumper of your car, you wear blue and gold. It is one way of saying Slava Ukraini. And today, on Tuesday, March 18, 2025, which is day 1119 of Russia's full-scale genocidal invasion of Ukraine, Chuck and I have every reason to say Slava Ukraini.
Heroim Slava. Thank you, everybody. Good night, and we'll be back real soon.